So we can move on to the next slide now. So the scale of permanence. Now, I think one of the main factors of food resilience is future thinking, so long-term plans. And this is really directed to having the knowledge of land-based management. Without the appropriate tools and without the appropriate knowledge to manage the land in a holistic way, this is where I think sort of modern agriculture falls short. We're sort of thinking very short-term crops, one-season crops, very quick rotations, lots of different management techniques, and this isn't a long-term strategy to build a resilient climate and also a resilient food network. So it really comes down to a cultural change in land management, using stewarding rather than ownership of the land. Now, crofting kind of fits into that model very well in a way. Obviously, most crofts tend to be governed by a larger estate, whether that's community owned or privately owned, and that has its own issues. But as a croft individually, it has a strong legal standing in terms of the longevity of who's owning that croft. So we have 10 years as tenants, and we can pass that on through generation to generation, as long as the croft's being used for agricultural purposes. So that brings the stewarding model very appropriately into crofting, and one that we're strongly working on at 44 Ranish, thinking ahead of how we can use the land and in terms of the long-term effects that we'll have on the next generation. So the scale of permanence is a nice model that comes from a man called Pierre Yeoman. He was based in Australia and came up with this set of permaculture design. And it's a way of managing your land, thinking about the most permanent features in the landscape to the most permanent features. So we've got climate, which is something that you can't affect. Something that's here. Just someone on there talking away. If you just remember to turn your mics off. So then there's things like land shape. So obviously we can't really change if you're on a hill, if you're on a wetland system, that's just the land you've got. So it's about working and being appropriate with your agricultural practices. You know, what's going to work in your climate, what's going to work with the land shape. And then everything leading on from there is more about the sort of infrastructure that you would need to run your agricultural business. So things like water supply, managing that. Here on the island, obviously not so much of an issue with lack of water, but definitely managing water is needed. And then obviously following on through all the infrastructures that you need to think about long term. So placement of roads that are appropriate, trees in the landscape for shelter and diversity in the future, permanent buildings, subdivision fences, and then lastly, soil, which is something that we can change dramatically very, very quickly, and also something that we can improve very, very quickly with the right techniques. So we'll move on to the next slide now. So understanding basic soil life and function, I think is primary in any food production. So most food comes from an agricultural background. Even if it's a processed food, it still usually has a source from a farm or a croft. And those crofters and farmers need to understand the basics of soil microorganisms. It's the life in the soil that promotes the health of the food and also increases the resilience in the practices. So I think practical education is something that's really important, and that's something we're doing on our Croft. We're offering workshops for locals to come along and learn about soil management, learn about composting, learn about growing techniques that work in our environment, something that we've tested for many years, and we can see the results coming through now. But also maybe linking up with the local college and encouraging them to really help new and young people coming into crofting to have the knowledge about soil and the knowledge of how to work with it in a holistic way. Agriculture is very much focused on a chemical-based approach at the moment, where we're looking at chemistry of the soil, which is just mainly looking at the minerals and what we can add to it, whereas organic growing or regenerative agriculture is focused on the biology of the soil. So how can we improve the biology of the soil to improve our crop production? That's the sort of main focus of any farm or any croft, is focusing on the health of the land before we focus on what crops we want to pull from that sort of agricultural practice. So if we move on to the next slide. So this goes into having clear principles that promote soil health. So these are just a few things that we use on our crop. We've got permaculture principles on the left-hand side there, and they have a set of 12 principles and 3 ethics. So the 3 ethics are a core belief system. They're earth care, they're people care, and they're fair share. So making sure that we're looking after everything in a balanced way. Then there's regenerative agriculture, which its main focus is to build that healthy soil and capturing carbon, which then just has a nice spiral effect and promotes the growth of everything that comes off that farming practice. Then there's no dig farming, which is more appropriate to what we're doing on our crop with a market garden. And that's a practice where we're not tilling the soil, we're not disturbing those microorganisms, we're just feeding them with good quality compost and building a healthier system. If we move on to the next slide, please. So a vision from the start. So I think this is really important for anybody going into crofting or an agriculture business is understanding what your goal is. You know, using those principles that you're going in with, understanding what works in your climate, and then having a clear vision. So this is how our croft looked like in the very beginning. It was a blank canvas. There was nothing being grown on there. There was no shelter on there. It was just really a sort of neglected piece of agricultural land. And if we move on to the next slide. Oh, back one. I think we might have missed one there. If we could go back a couple of slides. Oh, maybe not. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide and I'll just get my bearings. So adding diversity and working with the climate, this is obviously very important here on Lewis, especially with the wind conditions. So you can see in this picture here, we've got native hedging, which is nicely established now. And this is bringing us protection for our agricultural practices. We run a diverse market garden, and without wind protection, we wouldn't be able to grow the variety of produce we're working with. So understanding the world we live in and managing our land as a whole system. So understanding that we're not just an agricultural practice, that we are also part of the world we live in. We're part of the living system. We need to be providing habitats for the living system and enabling it to support us. And we're getting a fair share of produce from the land, but also giving back to the land that we're taking care of. We move on to the next slide. So careful water management. So this is something that's very key in a lot of the world. In a lot of areas, there's a lot of drought. Further south in England, we're seeing the effects of climate change on a dramatic level, where they're having droughts that they've never seen before, and the land is just becoming barren and their crops are failing. So careful water management across the whole agricultural sector, whether it's production directly on the land or whether this is production in factories, is, you know, how much water are we using, the embodied energy that takes to clean that water as well is something that needs to be carefully considered. So here is just an example, a very micro scale of how we manage water on our crop. So we have an excess of water. We never really have to water our crops in the summer here. We don't get dry weather. We tend to have too much rain to manage with. So we have created a wetland system at the bottom of our croft here. This is a pond, and this helps to just catch any sediment that runs off, and that's vital for managing pollution further downstream or into the sea, where you can end up in larger catchment areas where you've got big rivers that run through large areas of agricultural land. You end up with a lot of mineral ending up in the river and causing huge damage to the biodiversity, wiping out entire species of fish and entire species of microorganisms as well. So careful water management and controlling what flows off your land is key. One thing that permaculture really ties into is making sure that the water that you receive goes off cleaner than you received it. So you're sending water to your neighbour in a better state than you received it. We're very lucky where we are on our croft. We're actually on the top of the hill, so we're the first people to receive that water. So it's fresh, it doesn't have any pollutants, so we're very lucky in that sense. But in terms of larger agriculture practices, say on the mainland, people are using water from rivers. Those rivers are polluted with pesticides, with herbicides, with excess amounts of nitrogen fertilizers, and that has a real damaging effect on what you're watering. Can kill off microorganisms and really damage the ecosystem. So we'll move on to the next slide. So this is the current day croft. This is our croft. This is a nice aerial photo we got from a few years ago. And you can see that we've got quite a good layout there. It's quite well organized, quite well managed. But you can see around the edges where we've got trees in the landscape, where we've maybe not got such appropriate soil to manage, to work in an agricultural sense. So those areas are going to become, future plans. They're going to be woodland. They're going to be diversity. They're going to give mulch. They're going to give biomass. They're going to give shelter that could be used in the future for poultry production, for pigs, for agroforestry with grazing animals. So we've really kind of planned ahead with our croft, but we've got a clear focus that market gardening is our key agricultural practice. And in the centre there, you can see our market garden neatly laid out, well managed, well focused. And so we're generating a product. We're producing lots of high value vegetables from a sort of focal point of our croft, and then the sort of wider croft has got a longer term plan. So up to the sort of top right corner there, you can see the patches of grass are different colours, and this is where we're practicing rotational grazing, and this is something that's very good at stimulating grass growth and improving the biodiversity of wide open grassland areas. And that's a long-term approach on our crop, where we want to improve the grassland to generate a wider variety of agricultural practices. And in the future, maybe we can move to producing pastured poultry or egg-laying poultry, or even move on to larger livestock, such as sheep and cattle. If we move on to the next slide. So thoughtful production. So this is our market garden, and we put a lot of thought into how to set it up, into how to run it sustainably, both in terms of labour and also financing. So you can see that the market garden is very regimented. The beds are all the same size, the paths are all the same size, everything's the same length. And this allows us to be very well planified in our system. So it's not so diverse in terms of the wildlife that can live in the market garden, but it's a very focal area. So rather than having extensive vegetable growing, which takes up a lot of land, can take a lot more time and machinery, we're growing high intensity crops in a small space that's manageable on a human scale. If we move on to the next slide, please. So you're using local resources. So careful resource management is something that's key in all of agriculture across the whole sector. We see in sort of industrial agriculture the huge use of mined minerals to feed the soil, and these are going to run out. These are going to eventually be, the resources are going to be used up, and there won't be anything to add to the ground. So using careful local resources. So here we can see we've got seaweed which comes from the shore. Now we're not harvesting this seaweed, we're just collecting what washes in from the beach and using this to mulch and protect our soil, which helps to protect the microorganisms that will live within that system. So it's a free local resource. It's not costing us much except for labour to gather this material, and it's something that's abundant and is ever growing in the sea. We're not excessively harvesting this. There are local companies that do use the seaweed as a more commercial product, and they do that with careful management and leaving areas of the shore to rest for a prolonged period of time before harvesting again. And when they are harvesting, we actually benefit from that in our local area. We see that when they do harvest, there's a large amount of seaweed that washes in because they haven't managed to gather everything that they've harvested. So if we move on to the next slide. So local direct sales of produce. So this is really the most important thing in a food resilient network, is having that direct local sales, having the connection to community, and ideally not exporting everything that's produced. There's a lot of food sectors here on the island, especially in the fishing industry, where the products go straight from the boat to a warehouse and then straight in a lorry, and they get shipped off to overseas. They get shipped off to Europe, where there's demand and a big market, but they're sort of missing out the locals. You know, we don't really get an option to try and buy the local produce if we wanted to. It's partly a cultural thing. Maybe those products aren't something that's been consumed through history, but certainly shipping it off thousands of miles seems illogical in terms of the climate and carbon footprint. So trying to keep things local and sort of filling that local market before selling any excess products further afield, or making them into higher value products that can be stored and sold later through the season. So we've developed local direct sales with local markets, with restaurants, and we've also done direct sales with customers with weekly veg boxes, something that we found has been really useful. And sadly, with the closure of the local market, we are looking into that as a more future model for the business, is having those direct sales weekly to customers and receiving all the benefits, both financially but also socially as well. We move on to the next slide. So adding value and thinking ahead. So this really goes back to my point about the stewardship approach. You know, stewarding the land rather than just seeing it as a money-making exercise and having, you know, trying to get a quick turnaround. So if we steward the land and we think ahead, you know, what will we leave our children? What will we leave our next generation? You know, what's the long-term solution for the land? What's the most appropriate use of that land in the long term? So in the middle there, you've got an apple, which, you know, you might be surprised is actually grown here on Lewis, but with the right thinking and the right planning, having shelter in amongst agroforestry system, an apple crop or you know, a larger orchard could be something that really would be profitable in the long term. But you've got to think ahead. So we're planting these now. We're not going to really see much of a return in terms of produce and in terms of any monetary value. But say in 50 years' time, when those trees are mature and adapted and established, they could really be producing a large crop. So if people were to think about their crops as a whole and think about them in the long-term solution, we could really start seeing things like perennial cropping here as a more promising future, especially with the climate, with it being so wet. Sort of quick annual cropping here isn't so beneficial for the soil here, because it takes, you know, a lot of time to recover from ploughing and cultivation, whereas perennial cropping with trees and fruit bushes and apples are a really long-term solution. And also thinking ahead in terms of business planning. So if you're just growing sort of seasonal crops, thinking ahead and making preserves, things that can be sold through the whole season, longer term, but also that adding value as well. So those preserves can be sold for a higher value than the raw ingredients that it takes to produce them. And then finally, moving on to our last slide, community support and connection is key. So this really is the most important for building any resilience with any business, especially a food business, is knowing your community knowing what you're doing and supporting you in what you're doing. So we have open days on our Croft and we allow the public to come round. It's free of charge. We do this voluntarily. We've done it for the last 7 years. And it's been the best way to get to know our community, to build customers, and to build an understanding of what people want. And from those open days, we've really connected with the community in terms of offering workshops so people can hopefully gain the knowledge they need to move on and build a resilient food system for themselves. So that's coming to the end of my presentation there. So thank you for listening.
Good morning. I am Sarah Longbottom. I am the Outreach and Engagement Officer for Climate Hebrides, and I'm also a crofter on Lewis. In my presentation today, I will be combining these two elements of myself, and I'll be talking about my experience crofting in the changing climate that we're all experiencing, the practical impacts that I've been seeing personally. So I was assigned my croft 7 years ago. So in terms of crofting, I am very new. You know, crofting doesn't really work in days and weeks, but more in years and decades. So I am a new crofter. But even within my relatively short tenure, I'm already seeing changes on my croft in the 7 years that I've been working it. When I was first assigned my croft, every part of it was usable. There was a purpose for every part of my croft. Managed correctly, I could use all of it. Now, the bottom paddock, which, like many crofts, my croft extends right down to the sea. So the bottom paddock goes onto the macher. The bottom paddock of my croft is now unusable. It's waterlogged pretty much year round. If I were to put my livestock on that, they would churn up the ground, destroy the soil integrity, what there is left of it, like John was referencing earlier, and it would ruin their own feet. It would also pose a real danger to them, because if they were to be cast or even just bogged, and I wasn't on hand to help them out within minutes or hours, that's threat to life for them. So effectively what that means is part of my croft is now unusable in the very short time since I've had it. That much has changed. Even a single paddock becoming unusable illustrates how small changes in local conditions can have real practical consequences for crofting operations and therefore food production in the islands. So that's what I'm going to talk about today. So very relevant for the time of year. I believe a few of us in the room are gearing up for lambing, if not actively in lambing right now. Seasonal patterns, due to climate change, seasonal patterns are becoming less predictable and more extreme. Extended winters and later spring storms are having a direct impact on livestock management and directly on lambing and calving, of course. I'm just talking specifically about lambing because it's sheep that I rear. So in 2024, I'm sure a lot of people remember that we had Storm Kathleen roll through in April, which coincided smack bang in the middle of lambing for a lot of us. It was off. I think they recorded 85 miles per hour gusts. It was raining sideways, as we're all familiar with. And on a neighbouring croft to my own, one of the crofters reported a 60% loss of the lambs of that generation. That was due to a few reasons. There was genuine threat to life to go out and check on the lambs and check on the sheep as often as he would normally. So intervention wasn't possible where it was needed, and that caused some losses. But more, the larger effect was the fact the lambs were being born into the cold and into the wet. And that's the two worst things that lambs could be born into effectively. Well, I once had twins born directly into a river, but they were fine because I was on hand. But you couldn't be on hand during that storm. By sheer luck, I was really late putting my tup to the ewes the year before, the autumn before. I don't profess to claim that that was intentional and that I saw anything coming. I didn't. I was just incredibly disorganized, and extremely luckily so, because my lambing didn't start till the beginning of May. So all my lambs were safe in utero and not born into that storm. Had I been more organized, I would have been in the same boat. My lambs would have been born on time in April into Storm Kathleen. So that one weather event had shocking repercussions for livestock management on the islands. Within the same year, later in the summer in 2024, I was watching my sheep with a very sharp eye because it was getting really hot really early and really dry. And I was starting to note heat distress signs in my sheep. They were panting, they were lying down a lot during the day. And I actually made the decision to shear 4 weeks early in the summer of 24 to avoid the heat distress and avoid the danger to life that poses. So extreme weather events, no matter which way they go, are a threat to agriculture, whether it's a gloriously hot summer or a storm event, doesn't matter which way it swings, each has repercussions for livestock and rearing livestock. My last point on this slide here is the rising parasite pressure. We're seeing it's getting harder and harder to manage the tick. The parasite pressure, the parasite burden is getting harder and harder to manage. We're having to treat twice, 3 times a year now. That's because the warmer, so a hard frost will kill the larvae of tick and fleas. We're not really getting that many hard frosts in these warm, wetter winters that we're experiencing. So it's not killing the larvae. And then of those more larvae that are born, they're born into their ideal conditions, warm and wet. So the parasitic load is becoming quite hard to manage as well. That's just the visual ones. We've got liver fluke and all that sort of thing that crofters have to deal with. I know as a result of this, one of our hub members, one of our Outer Hebrides Climate Hub members, has deployed quail on his croft as a way to control the tick population naturally. This will reduce the need for chemical treatments. It's climate friendly. Obviously, it's an interesting form of livestock to be rearing, but it seems to be working really well. He's now disseminating quail amongst the community, which is fantastic. In this approach, this is a low impact method for maintaining animal health, and it really demonstrates how crofters can adopt innovative strategies that work with an ecosystem rather than working against it, i.e. pouring chemicals all over the issue. So I'll move on to my next slide. Now, John has talked a lot more than I ever could about crop production in the Outer Hebrides, far more experienced than I am. Where John has a market garden, I probably have a kitchen garden, if I can even call it that, to be honest. But even in my efforts, I'm seeing big changes in what and how I can grow. We've got the growing season in the Outer Hebrides is already short and intense, and it's becoming increasingly unpredictable. Extended winters are delaying planting in many cases, reducing the window available for outdoor crops, and extreme wind events can damage both the crops and the infrastructure we have in place to grow those crops. I have a polytunnel just on the side of my house here, and in December last year, Storm Bram came through, recording gusts of 89 miles per hour, and damaged my tunnel irreparably. Tore the cover almost clean off. I've built the frame in the same way that polycrub frames are built, so the frame is fine, but the cover is very much not. Fortunately, I didn't have much in the way of perennials in there, but that was one extreme event, and my outdoor infrastructure for covered growing is destroyed effectively. So yeah, not ideal. Measures such as windbreaks, as John has mentioned, measures such as windbreaks and indoor growing spaces are becoming essential to grow a lot of different crops. The practical adaptations that help extend growing season and protect crops, helping ensure that food production can, continue in the islands. But like I said, that infrastructure itself is at danger of climate change. John's already touched on this as well. I'm very sorry to be repeating. I'm not repeating the exact same things, but as you might imagine, the same themes come up when we're talking about agriculture and horticulture and whatnot. Water management on my croft is a little bit different. I'm going to be looking at this from an agricultural point of view, so I'm not just straight repeating what John has said. Wilder and more frequent rainfall events are increasing the pressure on the land and, like I said before, infrastructure. I've got a really nice setup on my croft whereby there is a freshwater loch behind my house and there's the sea in front of my house, and the two are connected by a freshwater river. And that's been really helpful for me because it means I don't have to lug water to the livestock. It means when we've got a drought on and we're all being told not to use hoses and whatnot, I'm not increasing the pressure on the domestic supply by lugging water to livestock. So it's been handy. However, with the wetter, more intense winters that we're having, and indeed springs and autumns, that river actually threatens its banks quite frequently now. The river runs past my house, so that's a direct threat to my property already, as well as threatening the rest of the land. In response, I have planted around about 300, combination of predominantly willow whips, and then I've got other native species in the mix. That's one that should be on your screen right now, doing quite well. The willows have voracious root systems that will help stabilize the soil and act effectively as a naturally occurring Gambian cage. I don't know if everyone's familiar with those, but surely. And effectively, they'll act as a natural form of bank reinforcement, a lot cheaper, a lot friendlier to the environment than actually going in and putting in Gambian cages. And that seems to be working really well. They're certainly thriving, and they should stabilize the soil nicely. Conversely, having said all that, the river's breaking its banks, there's too much water. In the summer, that river is now running dry quite often, which is meaning that as of yet, I haven't lugged water to the livestock. Instead, I've had to change my rotational grazing plan, and I'll put them in the field that now, abuts onto the freshwater loch to ensure that they have access to water. So that's another way in which I'm having to adapt. That's an operational adaptation. We're having to adapt crofting practices to allow both for the river flooding and the river drying up. Which very neatly brings me on to grazing management and soil resilience. The wetter ground conditions followed by dry, hot spells are affecting how I personally manage pasture. To maintain productivity, I am in the process of implementing rotational grazing across the Croft. That involves subdividing paddocks into smaller areas and intensively grazing livestock and then moving them on. The grazed areas are then rested for a longer period than they normally would be by virtue of the moving on. And that allows the grass to recover fully, which supports stronger leaf regrowth and deeper, more extensive root systems, which, as we've already heard about, is wonderful for in terms of protecting the soil's structure and biodiversity and whatnot. From a climate point of view, healthy grasslands capture and store carbon within their root systems and within healthy soil. So that means that maintaining pasture health can actually also contribute to climate mitigation. I'm having to, generally speaking, rotational grazing can be done with temporary fences. My livestock do not respect temporary fences, so we're actually having to implement permanent infrastructure to try and give this a go on our crop, but that's fine. It'll actually be really helpful in a lot of ways to have them in smaller areas in terms of lambing and shearing and all these gathering activities that we have to do. It will have more benefits than just positively managing the grassland, which is great. It's as you can see on your screen here, it's a low input strategy, slightly higher input than just leaving them to graze a larger area for months and months on end. Obviously, you have to move them more frequently, but that's not terribly difficult. She said, watch them all run up the fence line now that I've said that. But generally speaking, it is a low input strategy and it will support resilience and just proper pasture management. So supply chain and indirect climate impacts. Life on the islands in general is affected by climate change. I think we can all agree with that. Every one of us has seen empty shelves at the shops. The same impacts that impact us all individually can impact crofting as well. Crofting operations depend on wider systems beyond the croft itself, or even beyond the crofting community itself. In my case, and in the case of anyone that feeds grain, sheep feed and medical supplies even are imported via ferry. So we are, as crofters, we are also dependent on the ferry links being operative. Storms and adverse weather, as we all know, delay and disrupt sailings, which in turn can affect the availability of feed and the ability to maintain healthy livestock. These disruptions are becoming, as we all know, again, more and more frequent with the increasing extreme weather events. God, try saying that 5 times fast. So this highlights that the climate impacts we're all experiencing are not only environmental, but they also have logistical impact. Even where you're effectively managing your land, external dependencies can create additional vulnerability within crofting systems. Okay. So adapting to uncertainty. The increasing unpredictability of climate events is adding complexity to not only day-to-day croft management, but also seasonal decision-making. As we've already seen, pushing the tupping a bit later to then have lambing occur a bit later, changing our planting schedules, etc. On my croft, this has meant a range of practical adaptations as well. Polytunnel and the windbreaks that I'm currently hoping to grow, trying very hard to grow and replace my polytunnel cover. Rotational grazing, as I've mentioned, to support pasture resilience. Willow planting to stabilize riverbanks and stop that river breaking its banks. changing my grazing plan for the year to make sure my livestock have access to plentiful fresh water. Other crofters are, like I said, experimenting with natural pest control via quail, which is I just love. I think it's brilliant. These are just a few examples. There will be other crofters in other areas doing other wonderful things, I'm quite sure. And all these measures are aimed at maintaining productivity whilst stewarding and safeguarding the long-term health of the land. So, key impacts and lessons. Crofting in the Outer Hebrides is facing consistent climate pressures, reduced usable land, rising livestock risks during extreme events, increasing pest pressures. I'm so sorry. My nerves are starting to kick in at this point, of all points. Shorter and less predictable growing seasons and storm damage to infrastructure. Dependence on ferries for feed and medical supplies, and indeed export, because a lot of people export, adds an additional layer of vulnerability to crofting in general. The practical adaptations we've talked about, such as rotational grazing, infrastructure in place for horticulture, etc., demonstrate how crofting systems can respond effectively to these challenges. It's the response that will matter. It's the adaptation that will matter in terms of maintaining productivity while building resilience in a changing climate. So, I don't have to listen to me for much longer, I promise. In conclusion, crofting has always required resilience. We're a resilient people. I think you have to be to live on an outpost in the Northeast Atlantic. But the challenges facing crofters today are unprecedented. Producing food in the Outer Hebrides is increasingly complex, with greater demands on both land and management practices. Practical on-the-ground adaptations through pasture management, livestock care, crop protection, and infrastructure are essential to maintain productivity and safeguard ecological health, which John has explained far more eloquently than I ever could. Crofters are already implementing these strategies, demonstrating how small-scale, place-based systems can adapt effectively to climate pressures. Supporting these practices is critical for the future of crofting and for the future of sustainable food systems within the island, not only for sustaining the local production, but also for strengthening community resilience in the face of a changing climate. That is all from me for now. Happy to take any questions or comments.